So this is a much more important discussion about the fate of our republic in terms of technology. So we'll have this conversation with the commissioner. We'll sort of segue around a little bit around 10:30 into a panel that Doug Brady, who leads our telecom policy work, will moderate at that point. So let me start by introducing Commissioner Clyburn. She has served as acting chairwoman of the FCC following her appointment by President Obama in 2013. She was renominated by the President and confirmed by the U.S. Senate. She began her service at the FCC in 2009. Prior to that, had been on the Public Service Commission of South Carolina for 11 years, so really has a long and deep background in these questions. And having the state background, by the way, is really central, because a lot of these issues are federalist issues, if you will, how the states, localities, and federal government all interact, and that's really the focus of the conversation today. Prior to serving on the PSC in South Carolina, she was publisher and general manager of the Coastal Times, which is a Charleston-based weekly newspaper focused primarily on issues of the African American community in Charleston. She also is a graduate of the University of South Carolina and has a bachelor's degree in banking, finance, and economics. Again, pretty important set of skills for this particular area. So, Commissioner, I wanted to start by you put forth a sort of broad-based vision and action plan that you termed Solutions 2020, and it's really about the important challenge of addressing how do we get more and better broadband to more Americans, whether they're urban or rural, underserved. And a part of that, though, was really about infrastructure. There were a lot of components of it.
Yes.
Part of that was infrastructure siting. And maybe you could just open by talking about that and what you were hoping to accomplish.
Well, first of all, thank you for allowing this conversation to occur. I think it's timely, and I know it's important. Part of our vision for our Solutions 2020 plan came to be as a result of a Connecting Communities tour that we conducted between April and October of last year. We always think it's important. We think we know a lot inside of the Beltway and at our commissions and various jobs, but we actually do not, particularly when it comes to how communities engage, interact, and implement what we do. So it was important for us to get outside of the Beltway, and we did that during those months. And we talked to stakeholders. We went to schools and libraries, hospital, healthcare clinics, native lands, and met with some of the companies in this room. And what we found was both exciting and troubling. The exciting part is that communities are working together to really connect themselves. They recognize the importance of broadband and the type of infrastructure. Virginia just announced today, that they're definitely interested in streamlining the process and ensuring that communities have the tools they need to not only get well and stay healthy between broadband connectivity when it comes to telemedicine and telehealth, but to attract industry, to promote the public engagement, and do so many other things, social services and the like. Well, the sad part, the other side of the coin, the communities and the areas that were not connected. And we went to healthcare facilities trying to serve the underserved, people who need the most care. And they're not able to do a lot because they don't have the type of capacity needed. And their communities, and members of the communities, don't have the infrastructure needed to have a communicative, interactive conversation with them. And so we know that that's why we're here. In terms of the FCC, we're the best place to ensure that more ubiquitous, affordable service happens. But we also need to remind ourselves that it's a very delicate balance. It is not just infrastructure that is the key to access. It's affordability and all of that. And so we heard from a number of people. We put together this Solutions 2020 action plan. We had a forum, much like this one, where we heard from academics and stakeholders and high-level thinkers, and they made their pitches. We did it a little differently. We said, you got 3 minutes to make your pitch. And we stuck with that. There was one panel we let go because, they were stuck on the other side of the technological mindset. But anyway, we let them, don't tell them I said that. They gave pitches, solutions, because we said this is a solutions-only conference. We know what the problems are. We've been hearing about them. We've been talking about them. But what do we do? So they made their pitches, and we invited others to do a 350-word or less pitch. Solution straight, no chaser, straight to the point. I'm sorry, am I thinking about that? But seriously, we wanted to get straight to the heart of the issue. And we got some incredible solutions that we put forward that, and one of the pillars, there were 6, that came out of it is 5G and beyond, which is very germane to the conversation that we're going to have today.
No, that's great. Why, actually, you segued right into my next question, which is, we've been talking about this whole set of questions around digital opportunity and digital divide for, really 15, 20 years. And we've also been talking about how do we enable infrastructure siting. What's different now? Why now? Is there anything different now? You mentioned 5G, right?
And that is different. That is a game changer, and everybody recognizes that it is a game changer. But what it does also is it puts some increased pressures on communities. These applications for DAS and small cells are coming in, and there are a lot of communities. We talk about distributed antenna systems for those who don't do this every day. When you've got counties and when you've got local facilities having to go through this incredible pile of applications, that's something that they're not accustomed to. And just because the world is moving and changing and we're fixated on infrastructure build does not mean that those municipalities have the capacity to keep up. And so what we recognized early on is there something we can do, we can encourage to get rid of some of the bottlenecks? We worked with CTIA and then PCIA and the municipal associations to come up with a sort of an action plan where they could help. If all entities could help where there are capacity deficiencies, that was important for us to do. The National League of Cities is coming up with its own set of plans, which I think is extremely positive, that will help their members, sort of a template of phrase best practices gets overused, but I have to bring it forth here because it's attempting to do that. But to me, that's not all that needs to be done. Those companies in the room that are that know that their business models depend on it, they have got to work and speak with the communities in order to deal with these issues. We cannot go from zero to preemption, just in one swoop. I think that is a dangerous model. It will keep us in court for years. It will delay, prolong, and add on to the expense. So, what I am hoping for is a series of conversations. I don't know if the FCC should be the clearinghouse for that, but whoever or whatever it is, maybe this consortium with counties and with associations that represent companies. Maybe it's good for them to come together and say, what are the issues and challenges, and how can we work in this public-private partnership mode to ensure that we all get what we need.
So, actually, the point of it, for those who don't know, the big difference in 5G is it's not just 1 or 2 or 3 big cell towers, which are easy to permit, relatively easy, you only have 1 or 2. It's a lot of small cells all over the place.
On buildings, on poles, on anything. It's becoming, very interesting. In some cases, very beautiful. In some cases, very aesthetically challenging.
Promises, we're talking now maybe 600 megs a second. Really amazing speeds and all. So, I think the way I think about it is usually kind of 2 challenges. One is just the challenge of communities that just don't understand this. And yet some have really, I think, pioneered. I mean, I go back to my colleague Ray Richards, who was mayor of Fort Wayne, Indiana, and years and years and years ago, before fiber was anywhere really, he did a partnership with Verizon and said, you come here first, or you're first, and we'll streamline everything, we'll make it easy for you. And Verizon did that, and Fort Wayne was a big leader in that. I read yesterday in one of the tech publications that there is a similar partnership in Sacramento with the mayor there and Verizon, including doing some STEM education and 5G and all. So part of this is really about making or helping communities understand the promise of this and the new ways of permitting, that you don't have to. I mean, I think if we had a model where we have to get a permit for each individual cell, that's a nightmare.
Well, that slows things down, and that's why I'm excited about what the League of Cities and the other associations are doing. They are trying to come up with a model that said, what makes the most sense? How can we get from 0 to C safely and in a way that everybody is comfortable? And so, I am. If we allow the process to work itself out with guidelines. You've got to have, a really sort of a baseline for everyone to follow. I think all of us will realize our fullest potential. But going straight and using the word preemption first is not going to win you a lot of friends in local communities. I was in Mesa, Arizona, not so long ago, and the mayor was very candid with me. Look, he said, I'm not trying to stop anything, but my state has, passed, certain provisions that while some of the people in this room might be happy, the mayor of Mesa is very mixed in terms of how he feels, because right now, they're only getting a 1 or 2, I can't remember the number, but it's a very low number by way of compensation. And he is actually underwater when it comes to paying the people that have to do the services. That is not the optimal model for us to live by. By the same token, I know there are places, and I hope I don't go soon and get attacked, but they are taking advantage of, and there are just rates that are just not explainable. The communities, those two extremes are not optimal. Yeah. And so in order for us to find nirvana is possible, somewhere that takes into account the unique needs of the communities, what they have to do. Because siting in Charleston, South Carolina, in Columbia, South Carolina, or Montclair, South Carolina, those are going to be 3 different price planes. There's going to be 3 different cultures, geographic, demographic. A city that prides itself on aesthetics and tourism. It's not going to be the same as a town that, again, may have more corn stalks than people. And I say that, very sincerely. That is not a one-size-fits-all approach. And that's why I think the work of the FCC's BDAC augmented by having a way to have more robust influence by local officials. I think that is important for us to set the baseline for the conversations that must be had to connect communities. There is no city father or mother that wants their community left on the wrong side of the opportunities and digital and communications divide. None. Enlightened. None who are enlightened. But how do we get there?
How do you get enlightenment?
But sometimes enlightenment does not, again, like anything else, it might not come at the same time. And that's why you have to have prophets and evangelists. And I'm from the South, so I'm going to use this scripture. Yeah, right. With these, I heard you. I just got that. Yeah, I like that, Ron. But it's important to have, people who speak the same language. I speak with a Southern drawl. So if you come with more of an appreciation for that drawl, we might have the conversation will go to the next sentence. And so these are the types of things that I think, from a regulatory standpoint and from a standpoint of industry, we have to take into account in order to make these builds and these opportunities possible. But they've got to come to everyone, Rob. Having all of these bells and whistles available in the big cities and not the rural towns and hamlets, I think puts all of us at a disadvantage at the end of the day.
Yeah, so I couldn't agree more. You have really kind of 2 big questions. One is, where the market forces aren't quite enough to get you over the hump in the role for policy. There was another problem or question, though, which is we've written about this for years, and economists written about, is there is this notion that there are network effects of this, and what happens in the community affects the entire country.
Absolutely.
The kind of Metcalfe's law, the notion that the more people online, more people. And so you can have situations where what's rational for a community is not rational for the country. For example, a community that's just looking at this as rent-seeking and let's charge as much as possible. Or, there are communities, for example, that put very high taxes on wireless, which really, at the end of the day, hurt low-income families more than upper-income families. And so there is a precedent in the FCC of the shot clock to sort of try to balance that. It's not a preemption. It's not saying we're going to take it over, but if you don't do it in a certain amount of time, so I guess what do you think about that balance here? And it's hard to do a shot clock for a little teeny cell. I'm not saying that.
So one of the things that to spur the debate and get things, just a little maybe get about 2/3 of the room a little upset. Title II. You guys don't want to talk about Title II. But when you talk about, barriers when it comes, by way of those players that might be erecting extreme barriers to entry and subject to check, I believe that's Section 253 of the Act that would give the FCC the authority to act when it comes to that. When it comes to, say, uneven or unfair practices by way of broadband, of infrastructure deployment, I think it's Section 253.
There's got to be some lawyers.
Yeah, so 224. Yeah, 224 when it comes to non-discriminatory access. So Title II, from where I sit, and my pure reading, will give us the best, a way or best opportunity to address those issues. So for those who say no to Title II, I refer to them to the sections 220, 224 and 253. And I think that's the part of the solution to what you just put forward.
Let me ask you one question and last before I open it up, and that's, one of the sort of, I remember these conversations way back when we were doing 3G, and some people said, we have essentially, duopoly in a lot of places with cable and telephone and wires, and that the sort of promised land of having a third pipe, a wireless pipe, it really wasn't 3G. 3G wasn't good. It's not really 4G. 4G is not. It has some competitive pressures, but 5G really will. 5G really is a pure substitute, particularly if you get over the problem of data caps. It's a pure substitute. So it may even be better than a wireline solution. So here's my question. My question is, it's possible that in some communities you have a tension between sort of getting it out there with the economics and putting it in maybe 3/4 of the community to get it out there quickly and then get competition versus the old sort of franchise model where you have to put it out to every place. I guess, do you see that as a tension? And if so, how do we resolve it? Because both are important. We want another pipe for competition and we want ubiquity.
I can't tell you how many times, or how many, even I can think about one in particular conversation that I had when I was interim chair, exactly with that tension. Do we ensure that we move to the next generation in certain communities, or do we put the infrastructure or the regulatory infrastructure in place so those who are currently on the other side, way on the other side with no opportunities, no G, that we look out for them? And I decided on the latter, that if we never plant the seeds where there is a fertile ground or no growth, then they will never get there. We will continue to build. And so the first thing I wanted to say that I didn't say, that I'm being a little politically incorrect this morning, is I immediately went to the phrase redlining when you said that. Because to me that, in essence, whether it's your intention or not, that is the result, that you are building on the existing and enabling communities that already have, and the others always get left behind. I don't think we will ever prosper as a nation as long as the numbers have gone down. There may be less than 35,000 people with, in essence, 2G or less, in the nation, but they still are there. And there are still people with 3G, but the service is spotty. And so there is a great tension. With all due respect, I will never be a supporter of building on that 75% and leaving that 25% behind. That to me is not in keeping with my oath.
Sure. I mean, one way to sort of square that circle or reduce the tension would really be a much more robust set of policies to encourage people with digital literacy and device ownership and access. And, if we did that, then more people in
Did you say affordability? Did you mention affordability?
Did I? I thought I did.
Okay, maybe I missed it. I don't argue with what you put forth, but as long as okay, maybe I did. I will play the take back later.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So let me open it up for any questions that folks may have.
Yes. And if you identify yourself. I'm sorry, Rob.
You can be
No. I've got this Oprah thing that I'm going to realize before they go on to the other side of the divide.
Thank you for being here. I'm Marian Back from Morning Consult. You mentioned Section 224, and in October, the FCC weighed in support of the city of Louisville in a court case where AT&T sued them for removing a barrier to entry for Google. I wonder what yours, and Chairman Pai on his road trip has been talking about the importance of smaller players overcoming those boundaries to entry as well. I wonder what your sense is of whether, in the same vein of supporting competition, the FCC will stand by supporting one-touch make-ready pool attachments. Can you speak a little bit about your?
Well, that's one of the things that we teed up and gave voice to in our Solutions 2020 plan. We think that model and Dig Once and a lot of other initiatives are tools that I believe that are efficient, promote efficiencies and dexterity, and so I'm not going to speak negatively, even when situations may be less than perfect, on ways in which we can do things in a targeted, streamlined manner, things that can support that and honestly focus and enable local communities and provide services in an efficient manner and an expedited manner. I think those are that we should look as favorably as we can on them.
Any questions?
Yes, ma'am. That's Miss Montgomery County in the back.
Hi, Mitzi Herrera from Montgomery County. I want to thank you, Commissioner Clyburn, for including local governments in those discussions. And what I wanted to add is that I think an important component to include as well is the equipment manufacturers. Because what you find is a lot of these antenna makers are made in the U.S., good jobs, and they have lots of different solutions that they can deploy for every different community that helps the public accept these, and it's a win-win in many cases.
So I appreciate you mentioning that, because it's a part of the educational process for state and local communities would include that. Because if you don't talk about, the types of jobs they can bring from beginning to end, from the manufacturing side to the, infrastructure in terms of, people being able to, have jobs in their communities to do that. If you don't talk about that, communities will say, if you don't have someone as enlightened today, they're going to say, what's in it for me? And so we need to answer those questions. We need to address them. We need to address RF. We need to address, all of, these issues that may be uncomfortable right now. But if they're ignored, they're going to be bottlenecks going forward. One of the things I didn't mention that I think should be a part of this mix is to the FCC has successfully done and had webinars in other aspects of our, interaction with when it comes to policy making and very important issues like this one. I think we need to have a series of those that will better educate state and local officials on this. Again, I'm offering the FCC as a possible, place to have that, but I'm not wedded. It just needs to happen. And so if we have those types of things, and included is what Missy, talked about in terms of what are the opportunities, what are the deliverables, what are the benefits, along all of the benefits, all of the challenges, can't run away from them. But I think we would have a better, more efficient, streamlined way of addressing them.
I'm reminded of a story. I don't know if it's still true or not, but a number of years ago, there were a lot of complaints that Silicon Valley wireless system wasn't very good. I mean, venture capitalists on Sand Hill Road couldn't get good connectivity on their phones. And it was pretty clear what the problem was. The problem was the community didn't want to site cell towers. And I don't think people sort of understood the connection that you have bad connectivity because you don't allow cell towers. You can't you have to pick one. And I think to your point, educating people in the community that you have a choice. You can either have great connectivity with this wonderful new service, or you cannot.
But you have to figure out what the fear is. Is it fear RF? Is it fear? You've got to address what the fear is. And for us to continue to simply say that our current studies don't show that, it's not enough for some, people. And so you really have to transparency is the key here. Show and talk about it. Bring the scientists, even the scientists when we go like, oh my gosh. Bring them in the room, set the ground rules, because they'll talk all day. But you really have to have them and address what the fears are and show what you have and admit this is through today's lens. We don't know what tomorrow will bring, and if tomorrow shows something different, then we will have to have the tools to course correct. It's fear. It is a lack of information. I don't like to use the word ignorance. It's what we don't know now. Because we're not talking about ignorant people. We're just talking about, maybe communities that don't have all of the information needed. And in order for these bottlenecks to be lessened, to discontinue, these barriers to be lessened, we have got to figure out what from the South, what's the root cause, of all of this fear. And we've got to talk about it. We've got to address them. All of us have a role in that. Government, particularly federal government, could be a positive conduit for that. And that is what I'm calling, for my colleagues at the Commission to be.
No, I couldn't agree more. There's a group that we've called out every once in a while called StopSmartMeters.org. And if you look at the RF from smart meters, it's like, compared to the RF in your home, it's just infinitesimal. It's just, first of all, the RF in your home isn't the problem, but even that. And yet this group goes out and it gets a lot of people, and it plays on people. How many people are wireless engineers? And so, to your point, education is so important.
It is, and when you talk about emissions and all of that, I used to look, and this probably will explain a lot of what my problem is to many of you. I used to kind of peer into the microwave, and my mom like, that is going to kill you. And then, I just wanted to see things kind of bubble, and it turns out peering might actually, in terms of what it emits compared to, other devices that I use. Again, I might explain a lot to what makes me my dysfunction. And I still thought, your mom said not to peer. I still want to do it. So to your point, the everyday things that we use, the devices and, where we patch, those, if you look at the emissions, might actually be. But that is not the perception. And so you just have to, you have to deal what the perceptions are, address them, not dismissive, not saying that that's illogical. You've got, to educate, and it might not work today, it might not work tomorrow, but by the end of the year, maybe you move the needle.
Great. Maybe one more question, and then we'll go here because I think you're meeting. So one more question, then we're going to have to wrap up. So hold on.
Unless you want to do two, and I can wrap into one.
All right, let's do two. We'll wrap into one.
Okay.
There we go.
Now this might not work.
Thank you, Madam Moderator.
Yeah, I'm telling you, this whole thing is going to work.
Do you want to ask me questions too?
Yeah, I know.
Thank you. Julie Rhodes, telecom attorney, and thank you for your for being here again. What you were saying about the fears and tying into the fears for the radiation, and then the whole notion of educating about how these benefits can come about to these communities that are left out or that could benefit immensely from economic development, reminded me of what happens when you have a subway. And a subway and putting a stop in at a location. And then you see in the District of Columbia, at any rate, you see economic development start to sprout up, and it becomes a model. So models are important to educate and show how it transforms the economic vitality of a community. So I encourage you to make these entreaties to establish these models, and that can be a training in and of itself.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Thank you.
As you say, I should have told you to put that in the form of a question, but that's all right. I'm not going to give you a demerit on that one. Thank you.
My name is Ayan Alexander with Bloomberg BNA. The first half of my question, you mentioned conversations and webinars and things like that. What other suggestions do you have to try to find some type of compromise between these corporations and communities and making sure that everyone wins, I guess? And also, you also mentioned that it may not be the FCC, which I find commendable, but who else would you suggest could be the middle ground to bridge that gap?
So So to your non-question, I will say that, we have to be candid about the trade-offs we make. When you go online, you make a trade-off. You give up a little bit of yourself in terms of privacy and autonomy and the like. So we have to be candid with the communities that there are trade-offs. That stop might be disruptive, particularly in the building process, but it can pay dividends toward the end, as you mentioned. When you talk about what other models, I kind of hinted at it, I think, in addition, I think some type of consortium, I don't know what to call the model, but that loose association of associations, of city and county leaders, of industry, of academics and the like, talking about these issues and trying to create their own template. Like I said, the National League of Cities is doing something. There might be tension between the League of Cities and Association of Counties and the rural folk and the like. So we really need to get more voices in the room, and I think that will inform the BDAC. I think that will help with other communities that who don't think that there's enough representation on BDAC. And so I think that is a model, that consortium model, and having those conversations. Again, meeting people where they are, and that loose consortium has to include, I think, the academics and scientists and the like. I don't think that that gumbo, that pot, can be too big, as it relates to that. So it might not be completely answering your question, but I think the solution is having a clearinghouse or a way to have conversations that the concerns that exist, the bottlenecks, the reason why these bottlenecks exist, I think there needs to be a way to discuss them. Because again, if we strictly talk about the preemption model from the FCC, we're going to be in court for a long time. That is inefficient, that is expensive, and it will delay offerings, particularly in the communities that need it the most. And if I come up with any other ideas, I know how to compound you.
Well, there's also something that hopefully David Reddell will need to confirm today. We anticipate and hope something that the NTIA can also join you.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So we're going to move on to, so just be patient. We're going to take these out of the way. We're going to ask our panel to come on up. But before we do that, please join me in thanking
Are you taking this on?
All right, everyone, thank you for your patience with that little intermission there. So I'm Doug Brake, Senior Telecom Policy Analyst here at ITIF. We at ITIF focus on innovation policy and how it drives economic growth and productivity. And so, of course, advanced broadband networks is a key component to seeing the flourishing of advanced technological innovation. I think here in DC we tend to focus quite a bit on federal policy, but it seems especially in the last few years there's been an increasing focus, something of a shift when it comes to broadband deployment, focusing on state and really particularly local municipal level policies. Have started to take a front seat, sort of like as we learned with the Google Fiber project, right? A close cooperation between industry and municipalities can really do a lot to bend that cost curve of deploying new networks or upgrading existing networks. And this is even more important with 5G small cells, right? As we're moving from big macro towers to maybe 1 or 2 orders of magnitude more smaller cells. We really have to look at local policies. And there's a real national interest in leading in 5G infrastructure. Accenture projects that 5G wireless networks could create as many 3 million jobs nationwide and boost GDP by nearly $500 billion over the next 7 years. So the FCC is looking to update some of its policies. It has proposed a number of rule changes. There's also an advisory committee, the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, that has been stood up to examine potential rule changes, model code in advancing these initiatives. But it makes sense to sort of examine where opportunities for cooperation exist, where there's legitimate friction, and an open dialogue between municipalities and industry to find best practices and gain buy-in across all of these actors is potentially really the best way forward to see the long-term flourishing of these networks. So we've gathered a panel of experts that have been involved in these issues for quite some time. I'll run through, we have much longer bios online, but I'll give brief introductions. And then just by sort of flow of operations, we're going to move quickly into a sort of moderated or loose Q&A, and then we'll be taking questions from the audience. I will be attempting to take questions from Twitter. My understanding is there's some competition, there's something more interesting on Twitter going on, it seems, during this time. And so perhaps our hashtag might not be the #1 trending hashtag in DC, but we are using ITIF Broadband. We are using ITIF Broadband if anyone from Twitter wants to
ITIF Comey.
Might get more attention that way. So of course, here on my left is Van Blois. Van is is the Senior Government Affairs Counsel at the Wireless Infrastructure Association. There, Van leads WIA's state and local advocacy, including outreach to municipalities to coordinate dialogue among industry and local stakeholders. Next to Van is Joanne Hovis, who is president of CTC Technology and Energy. Joanne advises public sector clients regarding how to build strategy and opportunity for public-private partnerships in broadband, has long been a leader in this sort of cooperative model between municipalities driving public-private partnerships. Rebecca Hunter is with Crown Castle. She's leads the external affairs, corporate development, and strategy there. Rebecca has experience in really all aspects of wireless deployment, has worked with macro, small cells, and fiber throughout the United States on a local, regional, and national scale. Next, we have Hans Riemer. who is the at-large Montgomery member of the Montgomery County Council. Councilmember Reamer was first elected to Montgomery County, Maryland in 2010. He represents over 1 million residents as the at-large member. He's long been a champion of extending broadband and Wi-Fi to Montgomery County residents. And batting cleanup, we have Brian Tremont. He's managing partner at Wilkinson Parker Nauer. Mr. Tremont served as the chief of staff at the Federal Communications Commission under Chairman Michael Powell. Perhaps most relevant to the proceeding, he represented mobility in a petition, though correct me if I'm wrong, you will be speaking on your own behalf, not on behalf of mobility. Wonderful. Yeah, so let me start with you, Van. I'm curious to get a sense of your organization and where you think WIA sees the biggest opportunity for cooperation with municipalities, and perhaps some initial thoughts on what the FCC sort of teed up.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you to ITF for inviting us here to be part of this most exciting panel of the President's Infrastructure Week. So we, I think all of us on the panel here agree that the issue at hand is to get more broadband to citizens and businesses. We've all been there when we don't have a signal, and we see new features coming out for phones, and we see an increasing demand, especially for streaming video, which is putting a strain on the nation's wireless networks. I think we also agree that to get broadband, we need more infrastructure. And that's why I'm here. I represent the companies that build, deploy, maintain, and upgrade our nation's wireless infrastructure. Companies like Crown Castle. So I think to play off what the commissioner said earlier, we know what the problems are. We need to focus on what the solutions are. And so WIA has some of those solutions, and I'm happy to outline some of those and talk about those today. But we're looking at a very fiercely competitive wireless market with 4 national wireless carriers. For the first time, the CDC is reporting that over 50% of American households don't have a landline phone anymore. And so this is also, it's important that there is that infrastructure and that provides the backbone for all of our wireless communications and the advance toward 5G service. So when we talk about macro cells, the tall towers that we're used to seeing, and we talk about small cells, I think it's important to understand that small cells are being deployed today in today's 4G network. There are incredible capacity constraints on today's networks, and so this isn't sort of a pie in the sky when folks can talk about connected cars and all the amazing things that 5G promises. This is a problem of today, and that our members are working to solve today. Because we want to make sure that there's enough 4G signal for you all to stream House of Cards, wherever you are in DC, or you can just turn on C-SPAN. So some of I'd say if I could boil down WI's positions on this into 5 key points. The first is access to poles, access to rights-of-way, and access to municipal infrastructure in the rights-of-way. That is key, especially as we're looking at 5G requiring increasingly high-band spectrum. That high-band spectrum has a very low latency, which is great, but it also has a very short range, which means that we need to come closer to where those citizens and businesses are, and oftentimes that can be deployed most effectively in rights-of-way. Our organization wants to promote shared use or co-location. So you'll frequently see when you're driving out 66, there are towers that have multiple levels of antennas on them. That is a benefit of a co-location policy that dates back to the 2001 co-location agreement. So this is something that the FCC and the historic preservation community saw as important to promote shared use of those towers. And that's something that we want to see moving forward into the 5G environment, is where there are neutral host systems that can host multiple carriers at once, even in a small cell environment. We like to see standard processes for applications and permitting. Our members deploy nationally, and it's vital that we have that certainty that's required for the investment. And so having standard application processes, having published fee schedules, that's really important for our members to have that certainty for deployment. And finally, I think it's important to define what we're talking about. There's so many different ways to deploy wireless technology between tall towers, small cells, Wi-Fi, in-building systems, fiber. All of these things are necessary, but it's important to define what those are. And so we at WIA follow the FCC's definitions for what a small cell is, and that's based on volume, because it's a technology-neutral way to say, we're not going to lock in the definition of a small cell today because it could change tomorrow, and probably will. So by defining it by volume and adding a height restriction, that puts the certainty in the minds of local communities to say, okay, I understand what this is. This is small, this is a small cell, and this is what you're talking about when you come to me with an application for 200 small cells within my jurisdiction. That sort of understanding is important. So appreciate the invitation and look forward to the dialogue.
Great, thank you, Ben. Joanne, so you've been working with public-private partnerships for some time, advising cities on how to move forward with these sort of models. I'm curious, lessons you've learned, what you're most excited about, and the sort of opportunities you see, especially with what the FCC has teed up. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug, and thanks for inviting me to be here today. I'm really glad to be here. I was particularly excited about it because of the title of this event, which is How Municipalities and Industry Can Collaborate to Spur Broadband Deployment. And I would change municipalities by the way to localities. I think it's important to include counties and parishes and towns and so on, as well as towns and cities. But that topic is, as Doug says, pretty near and dear to my heart. I work pretty extensively on developing strategies and ways for localities to work with private industry. And I think that's critically important and sometimes very much missed in the conversation, and that's a huge lost opportunity. The conversation tends to be, what are municipalities, and I would say localities, the question is always, what are they doing wrong? What are they misunderstanding? Why are they not doing this right? And I would say that's really the wrong set of questions. The question is, how can localities and companies work together toward win-win solutions? Because it is, frankly, entirely a misunderstanding of what communities care about to assume or to state that they're either ignorant of the benefits of broadband or they're just greedy and seeking rents. It's not, in fact, the case. I talk with hundreds of localities every year, and without exception, their number one priority, always, in talking to me about communications, is how do we get more broadband in this community? It is, I think, insulting to communities to assume that council members and mayors and parish presidents and so on don't understand the importance of broadband for their economic well-being in the short and long terms. They do. They understand, in many cases, far better than we do, and they understand what it means in their localities. In my experience, they are always seeking ways to facilitate and enable and promote and attract private investment. And I would say that if the private sector approaches localities with that same spirit of respect and collaboration, we'll see incredible innovation at the local level. I think we have seen that. The Google Fiber story, I think, is first and foremost a reflection of just how desperately hungry localities were for really robust broadband and for competition in many cases. And 1,100 localities essentially offering to roll out the red carpet. And everyone that was ever approached by Google specifically rolled out a very, very nice red carpet for Google and for any other company that would similarly invest in their community. Those are illustrations of what I'm getting at. In the wireless area, I think we're seeing incredible innovation at the local level where communities are considering how to use assets, how to use taxpayer-funded mechanisms to try to attract, incent, and enable private deployment. And I think in many cases they're actually offering up considerable amounts of value. If they're approached with the same respect and collaboration, I think we'll see tremendous outcomes. Finally, one last thought, since you asked me about the FCC. As far as what the FCC is teeing up, I have to admit I'm rather concerned, and thank you, Commissioner Clyburn, for noting the importance of local participation, which has thus far really not been robust. I'm concerned because I think that preemption and one-size-fits-all rules eliminate the opportunity for innovation and creativity between public and private sectors at the local level. And with all due respect to all of us sitting in this room, we really don't know what's happening at most local levels. Probably a third of us here live in Montgomery County, Maryland. I found in working on some strategies for the county a decade ago, I found I did not know any policymaker, including at that time, the consultant to the county, who was me. I did not recognize how much of Montgomery County is actually rural. When I told people in Washington that, I got blank looks or arguments. If we don't know exactly what the local needs for broadband are, by the way, very much unserved, the rural parts of Montgomery County, that's just a few miles up the road from here. How can we possibly know what's going on all over the country and what the needs are at the local level? And I think we should give respect to local officials to be able to work with the private sector to meet those needs.
Thank you very much. Rebecca, I'm curious to Crown Castle's perspective. My understanding is you work trying to work with cities to get that red carpet rolled out, right? So I'm curious what you see as the biggest opportunity your experience so far.
Well, thank you. Again, this is a topic that is very important, and this is something that we try to engage on almost on a daily basis at some level. Specifically, first, I think Van laid out a lot of our kind of high-level positions and some of the things that we do need and would like to see from a discussion point when we do meet with municipalities. But I think I'll focus on engagement, right? So I think engagement is why we're here to kind of talk about it. And at Crown Castle, that's something that we really are trying to do more of. We are actually this year members of National League of Cities, National Association of Counties, and the working group that Commissioner Clyburn mentioned. We are part of that along with WIA, some other industry partners, and a lot of various municipal, county, and other associations that do represent a municipal or locality perspective. So we feel strongly that there's a balance. Google gets mentioned, quite a bit, and they did a lot for, initiating some of these conversations and trying to come up with partnerships. But then they stopped. I think that they found that some of those cooperations, they thought it's challenging to go locality by locality and negotiate with every person at a starting of a 0 point. So there does need to be some sort of balance between efficiency and time frames and reliability on what we can expect when we go state by state and locality by locality. I was moderating a panel on smart communities just yesterday in Dallas at TIA. So we are trying to engage more of the vendor community. We are trying to engage as many of those players and bring them to the table. And I think, though, one of the panelists yesterday was from Kansas City, and she said, these decisions, technology and issues are local. What works in Kansas City is not what's going to work in Charleston, South Carolina. So we, as an industry, do need to recognize that and do need to appreciate that and go in with that attitude. However, we need to understand we have the same objective. There are both every mayor, every community we've talked to, right? You do want broadband infrastructure. You do want to provide for your citizens. You do see the benefit in economic development, in public safety, in public health. And so where is that road? Sometimes it's not as straight as we as industry would like it to be, but we think we're on the same road. Maybe in some cases we're kind of a little parallel, but ultimately we do have the same objective. And I think any conversation that we have, starting off by what we agree on, you're going to have a better conversation and more constructive conversation on those things that you might not agree on. But with that commonality of starting point, I think that's where the conversations come in, and that's really, you can have a very constructive engagement and move it forward. So I do think it's going to be a combination of those local conversations and understanding, but we also see a definite need, for understanding a more streamlined process.
Councilmember, I'm curious to get your perspective. My understanding is you all have been working with a small cell deployment, looking at some of your zoning ordinances. So yeah, to hear some of your experiences with that process, where do you think there's opportunity to find this balance between more efficient process versus one that reflects the sort of particularities of a single locality?
Thank you. Well, I want to express I really appreciate the wisdom that I'm hearing in ITIF's description of the dynamic that we're in right now. I think we need to look at the long view here and think about the big picture, which is that all deployment is local and all infrastructure is local. And we need to have a collaborative relationship at all levels of government in order to succeed and not get too short-sighted about the next 6 months or the next year. We got to think about how this is going to keep reinventing itself in every generation and over time. So. And I really want to express appreciation for the Commissioner's comments. I hope that we can maybe get a video out to every local government in America of your words. I think we've been waiting for your leadership, and we're excited. So thank you. Really appreciate that. I think the general framework is we need for the FCC and from a national level to think about how to support local governments to be successful in their deployment and help local governments be effective as partners in the process. And we recognize that we have our work cut out for us. There's no question about that. So as you mentioned, we're now having to rewrite our zoning code because our zoning code really contemplates big towers. It doesn't contemplate small towers. The processes are designed for dozens of towers, not hundreds of towers, and we now expect that we'll have maybe 600-700 towers over the next applications over the next few years. So we have to change how we do business, and we recognize that. At the same time, we feel that it's crucial for local government to be at the table in order to make sure that deployments are respectful for communities. And just as probably the most, intense example is most communities now that are new are built with underground utilities. So in Montgomery County, where we are here, since the mid-'80s, all new suburban subdivisions have been built with underground utilities. So, when you look at the suburbs and the exurbs of America, you are often talking about communities where they don't have utility poles. And if you don't have local government in the process to help figure out how to deploy into those neighborhoods, you're not going to get as good of a deployment, and you're going to have a tremendous backlash, I think, from the communities. And that's going to be down to Congress and to all the policy issues that we care about. And I think it'll have consequences down the road. So, it is tough to figure out how to get that done, but it's just not going to happen well if you don't have local governments trying to figure it out with you. And that really can be done. But it does take time, and we're working hard on it now. The other point I want to make is I think you need local government at the table in order to be sure that the deployments are equitable. If local government doesn't have value that it is negotiating over, if we're not allowed to charge fair fees for our service or fair market value for the space that private companies want to use, we don't have any leverage in this negotiation, then we can't ensure a more equitable distribution of the benefits of deployment. So, what we're seeing so far is deployment is going where it has gone before. Deployment is not going into rural communities. Deployment is not going into underserved communities. Deployment is going where the money is. And that dynamic isn't going to change unless, a combination of requirements and incentives are put into the process. So, that local government has a role to play in that. But I am optimistic. I think that we want super high-speed internet. That's the bottom line. We know we need it. Our residents need it. Whether it's the silly things like watching kitten videos or whether it's telemedicine, whatever it is, this is the future, and we know we've got to get there. But we need support from national policymakers and leaders to help us through that process. So I really liked what the Commissioner was describing about kind of a consortium or a leadership group. I think once we kind of pin down examples, and they don't have to be requirements on local governments, but best practices for us to voluntarily choose from, I think this can move very quickly. I think we can really socialize that really quickly, and we'd like to be a part of that.
Excellent. Finally, Brian, if you could offer your perspective, I'm curious what you think, if maybe if you could get into some of the specifics of what the FCC has put on the table, what potential rule changes could potentially best drive real investment in next generation networks.
Sure. So first of all, I want to thank ITIF and Rob for having us here. And I particularly want to call out the great work that Doug has done in his time at ITIF, amazing contribution to the intellectual framework of all broadband policy, and so really applaud that. And I also want to call it ILIF because as an intern here at ITIF, a rising star at CU Law School, maybe looking for a job next fall if anyone's looking for a good associate, just want to mention that. So I really appreciate the conversation this morning, and Commissioner Clyburn and I talk a lot about one of our favorite words, which is engagement, and the importance of bringing everyone together. And I think that is a key part of this. And part of the reason that's so important here is no one party is responsible, right? So you could have the carriers, doing what they do, but without the partnership of government at the state and federal and local level, it doesn't work. And you could have state, federal, and local government doing what they're, doing their jobs perfectly, but without the carriers, it won't work. And without the infrastructure providers. So it has got to be a partnership among all of the relevant stakeholders, or it simply won't work. It is a critical time for the country in this space. Jobs, infrastructure creation, investment are so important. We see it all across the economy. Van mentioned the President's Infrastructure Week. We are trying to find ways to spur investment in the kinds of bricks and mortar and everyday well-paying jobs across our economy. And here's an example where industry is prepared to spend tens of billions of dollars a year to do this. And I think we have a responsibility to find ways in which that can happen. And 5G is going to cost tens of billions more because of the infrastructure challenges we discussed, right? It is a fundamental shift, and you touched on this. It's not the same old infrastructure deployment. It is not the big macro cells where you have 3 per community. It's hundreds of cells in each community, and it requires a paradigm shift, both for the carriers, for the tower infrastructure companies, for state and local and federal government. And I think what you're seeing, and this is reflected in the FCC's open rulemakings, but I think you see it up and down the line. Everyone is shifting and adapting to what this new environment is going to be like, including the new economics, and we're not totally clear it's going to work. We do not have ubiquitous 5G deployments today. We don't exactly know what all the use cases are. We don't know exactly how fast it's going to be deployed or who's going to be deploying it. So there's a lot of unknowns as we head into this, and it does require a constant communication and engagement among all the relevant stakeholders. I think the Commission is to be applauded for taking some of the important steps on issues that are on their side of the equation. So one is making spectrum available. So we've seen this in the Spectrum Frontiers proceeding, the incentive auction, other recent spectrum efforts. We have another order potentially coming up on Spectrum Frontiers, so kudos to them for that. Commissioner Clyburn mentioned the importance of ubiquity and affordability. That is what Adapting Universal Service Program is designed to do. That is a federal responsibility at some level, but there's also state programs, and I think localities can do a lot to encourage both affordability and ubiquity. And that we made important steps there, but that's not over. The focus today is on infrastructure investment, right, and from a public policy perspective. And Congress has delegated certain responsibilities to the FCC in this regard. And one of the statutory provisions that I think Commissioner Clyburn touched on was 253. That talks about the responsibility of localities and the role of federal government in balancing with them to manage the public rights of way and to require fair and reasonable compensation from telecom providers on a competitively neutral basis for use of the public rights of way on a non-discriminatory matter if such compensation is publicly disclosed. And Doug referenced the mobility petition earlier. It is asking for the FCC to interpret what those terms mean. What does fair and reasonable compensation mean? Does it mean cost-based, or does it mean market-based? What does it mean to be competitively neutral and non-discriminatory? Is it fair if the wireline companies who use the rights of way get charged 50 cents a month and the wireless connections get $500 a month? Is that fair? What is water charged? What is wireless charged, et cetera? And then finally, publicly disclosed. And Van talked about the importance of this. One of the challenges is that oftentimes these rates are not readily available or readily disclosed by municipalities, and that makes things harder for everyone involved. So that's the 3 areas in which the mobility petition seeks some clarification. the FCC has gone further and now has both a PN and a notice of proposed rulemaking that addresses, and an NOI for that matter, every possible procedural vehicle is in play for wired and for wireless. That talks about the role of a variety of different elements on the federal regime, including the role of National Historic Preservation Authorities, of tribal lands. I mean, there's a host of environmental protection issues, as well as the more core 332 issues. So there are a bunch of pieces of the puzzle that are out there, and I think all of us are just trying to adapt to what these changed circumstances are. And we talked a little bit about Google earlier. I think Google's a great example of how a paradigm was shifted because of Google's interest in entering the market. So you mentioned the red carpet. I think we'd like for the carpet to be red for everyone and to be rolled out with similar enthusiasm as it was for Google in Kansas City. As was also alluded to, Google's no longer deploying in the same way. So we have to find ways that that partners, communities, and investors partner together to get connectivity in an affordable and ubiquitous way in the communities that want it, where their investment's there. So I think there's some real challenges here, but it's a lot about adapting to changed circumstances, which will require us all to work together. The last point I'll make is and it was touched on earlier, it may not work that we retrofit our communities to be connected. It may be that we need to move to something that looks more like connectivity by design. And that is to say, every time you build a building, every time you build a road, it is baked into the infrastructure that you have 5G connectivity. And it may be that the economic model is going to change. You know, when somebody built this building, the electric company didn't come wire it, and the water company didn't come put all the pipes in. So it may be that we're going to move to a neutral host model where the building owner is doing the connectivity by design and the carriers plug in. But we need to be thinking about that as a broader public policy question, because I'm not sure that we don't know for sure, but I'm not sure what 5G is going to look like, but it may need to look like something much more intentional than what we're trying to do right now.
Thank you very much, Brian. So, to my mind, it sounds like the real question is how do we balance the interest in seeing much more efficient, streamlined process, much faster permitting, and access to be able to see the investment of really quick, streamlined deployment of 5G versus the balance on the other side is the real state and local interests. I do worry sometimes for very legitimate reasons that the national interest in being for competitive reasons, internationally competitive reasons, having real robust deployment of 5G can diverge from the state and local interests, right? In a very legitimate way, right? It's like they just have different interests in the outcome of these sort of proceedings. And so I feel like we've had a lot of sort of agreement on the high level. I want to try to dig down and pull out where there's legitimate disagreement on where that line, where that balance gets to be drawn. And I think maybe one that I started to hear down at the far end of the table is this issue of actual cost of access to rights of way to poles. Hans, you mentioned that this needs to be market-based, whereas I believe it's been put on the table that to some extent we should be shifting more to a cost-based model if we're going to see really robust deployment of a far greater number of small cells. And so I'm curious if you think, is that fair to say that's one of the biggest sort of rubs and like where we make that balance? Is that and I don't know your thoughts on
No question about it. I mean, we agree with cost-based recapture for the cost of permit processing and things like that. But public space, the local taxpayers invest in what makes public space valuable. You know, every penny of our budget goes to making public space valuable, which is why companies want to deploy their infrastructure there, because that's where all the people are. And we just think it is a basic principle that we should be able to charge a fair market value for companies that want to, use public space. And so that's just a basic principle.
So when you say public space, do you mean City Hall or do you mean the rights of way?
It's all public space. Every road is public space. Right-of-way is public space. Buildings are public space. This is space that is valuable because taxpayers pay to make it valuable and communities come together around it. So, we have a model with cable franchises that has that's a value proposition. And if you remove, by the way, local government's ability to charge fair market value for private space, that's going to have a big effect on what private providers can charge, private property owners can charge as well.
But since the beginning of, first.
I was going to say, I mean, that you definitely picked out one of the fundamental differences, I think, between industry and localities on this issue. I think it is, important that there is an understanding over where that lies. There's a lot of activity on state legislation on this issue, and we saw in one state that's considering the legislation, they said, okay, well, why don't we make this more expensive in rural areas, because that will promote deployment and it will be an economic incentive for rural America. And the providers were like, no, that's not going to incent deployment, that will repel deployment. And so I think, having an understanding that the public right-of-way is, it is essentially for 5G deployment, it is a monopoly. The utilities and the city have a monopoly over the structures and the access to that right-of-way, where essentially, for a 4G small cell or a 5G small cell, that's the only place to put it. And so you see, I think WIA would support adoption of a model similar to the pole attachment agreement, or the pole attachment rulemaking in 2011, that under 224 they said, okay, we understand that utility poles are essentially a monopoly for attachment, and they should not be able to exercise that monopoly power over pricing. And so the FCC set pricing, and about half the states adopted the FCC's order in that respect. So I think it's that there is definitely a misunderstanding over what the public right-of-way is and what is the best way to incentivize deployment. And I think we'd like something more akin to the pole attachment order.
So,
well, I would just say, I'll let you speak.
Okay, that's right. So, since the beginning of government, rights of way have been managed in the public interest. That is the charge of local government, and initially that was for electric and for water and a host of other utilities. It's supposed to be managed for the common good. It is not a real estate deal. It is supposed to be, I think we can draw distinctions. The City Hall, I think, is potentially a different situation, but the rights of way are inherently there to serve the public. One of the things the public benefits from is connectivity to 5G, and with all due respect to Crown Castle, they're not a piñata. Like, we don't just bang on them and money comes out. It is important if you take money away, if you charge rent fees that are beyond costs, and nobody's talking about denying costs. It is taking money away from investment and jobs in those communities. So I just don't think that trade-off is one that I don't think it's what the statute contemplated, and I don't actually think it's in the public interest.
Okay, so I think that if local governments don't have value that they are bringing to the table that they are able to negotiate for, then they don't have leverage in this conversation. So I don't think, as a policy matter, local government has any more ability to move our policy agenda of how to enhance deployment through more public Wi-Fi, or more deployment into rural areas, or more deployment into low-income areas. I think we have to have something that the companies need. And if we're simply, a pass-through where there's just a cost-based fee and the company moves on, then we're only going to see the digital divide exacerbated. I think you need local government at the table in order to achieve some of those social goals. So fair market value can vary. I mean, to your example, in a rural area, I'm sure the market value is lower than in an urban area. There's no question about that. There are principles that need to be recognized in this, but we invest. The taxpayers come first. Why should we advantage ratepayers at the expense of taxpayers? Taxpayers make public space valuable.
And a lot of times this conversation stops at that discussion of revenue. And I like the word value. You mentioned that's not market value, but value. Because everything that we've talked about here, and I think, again, at the point of agreement is 5G broadband brings economic development. Economic development brings business, brings, a broader tax base, brings those other things. So if you try to just look at from how much money might you get per pole, you lose the conversation of the benefits, the total package benefits. And also through a lot of the technologies, and you talk smarter communities and things like that, what about the efficiencies in government? What about the cost savings? so the conversation about money, which is one of the sticking points, it really needs to be broadened to overall economic value or value benefits to your citizens beyond just how much money are you going to get, how much revenue are you going to generate per pole, because you don't see the big picture. It really is, to your point, you mentioned looking at the long term and not just the next 6 months. And I think by limiting the conversation to that one very small factor in a very long-term idea here, a very long-term concept, because your economic development is going to far exceed if you increase your tax base and bring conventions and tourism and everything else. That is where your growth is going to come from.
And I'm not saying we should be able to charge as much as we want under any circumstance. I'm just saying there is a value that is greater than purely the cost of deploying. It represents the value of that public space, the value of that community, the value of that market opportunity as well.
But you don't look at leverage when you're doing electric or water, right?
Well, those are public utilities. These are not. These are private companies that are renting public space.
We're public.
Well,
All right, I hope we can move on to a few more issues before we open up to. I was hoping to draw out debate, and I succeeded.
I was quiet for all of that. I would just say I honestly think local governments understand the economic development and all the other impacts of broadband. I think we should not assume that they don't get it. I think suggesting that they're only focused on the revenue part is just dead wrong and frankly disrespectful. And what's driving this conversation about the dollar side is a company's attempt to reduce its operating costs and shift the cost of doing business from private to public sector. It's not local governments failing to understand the value of broadband. Quite the contrary.
And just, for clarification here, certainly I did not say that they didn't. I was simply suggesting that in many cases, the conversation revolves around revenue. Not that they don't, because like I said, I truly believe we have the same goals at the end of the day. I just think that sometimes, just like this conversation, you bring up the money aspect of it, and all of a sudden, you get in a defensive position on both sides. And if you can start with where you agree, you can have a constructive conversation about the middle. And so that was all I was suggesting.
so we need some funding in order to deploy wire and wireless into our schools and our public buildings, and to advance all of our objectives with local telecom policy.
I think that's a really important point, though, that I think we probably need as a community to think through, which is that those goals are very important. And there are federal programs designed to help on some of those issues. There are state programs. And the open question is whether or not this is a vehicle to achieve those goals or not. And I think that's the open question that maybe we do differ on. But I don't think anybody, just as nobody disagrees about the economics importance of broadband, nobody disagrees about the importance of the things you just described. It's just a matter of how we get there.
All right, so moving on. I'm going to add another mechanism rather than purely changing rules, preemption, or control of these things. It seems like at least part of the Google Fiber, the model of the Google Fiber experiment was creating an example. If you have a city working with industry to deploy the systems, and who's sort of out in front in a particular project, that can serve as an example. And so, this is one of the advantages, right? Having different localities try different models. And so, I'm curious if there's anyone out there that maybe Rebecca, this is a question for you, but are there anyone out there who you think is really doing it right, and what sort of things are we seeing spill out of a really robust deployment that we can point to as perhaps a model for other cities going forward?
I do. There are lots of municipalities that are doing great things. Now, I don't think that we've seen anything at scale. This was a conversation like I just had yesterday, but Kansas City has a wonderful example of a smart city deployment. Again, they're trying it, right? Let's see what works. Let's see how our partners work. But they got it's industry, it's community. They're partnered. They've done a great job. The Dallas Innovation Alliance in Dallas, similar, a wonderful, amazing innovation zone that they created in Dallas. The city of Boston is doing some really good things. You could go on and on about the good things, and back to kind of the engagement and communication. One of the things that we're trying to work with National League of Cities and Association of Counties on is getting that information out. That there are so many good partnerships out there. There are so many lessons learned, if you will. I'm probably not going to quite go to best practices yet, but there are good news stories where industry, universities, cities are truly coming together to partner on innovative and creative solutions. And we need to tell those stories. It's easy to hear about where it's not working. It's easy to hear about cities where, they don't like us and we don't like them. But I think it is important and imperative right now to tell the good stories.
And to that point, I think Rhode Island actually is a very good example of a state that is statewide looking at this and saying, how can we, they're consulting with Blair Levin, who I'm sure is known to most, if not all, of the folks in this room. How can we attract investment? And they're starting now to say, we know 5G deployment is going to be commercially available in 3 years from now. Let's bring all the parties in the room and say, what can we do to modify our policies either at the state level through state legislation or at our public utility commissions or even individual cities to say, we're ready for 5G and we want to be the first state that deploys 5G across the state. And that, I think, Rhode Island's smallness is a asset to them in that they already have good wired connections, and I think they're looking at how to leverage that into the next generation of connectivity.
And there are some great examples. Boston is a great example. But even the Boston Agreement doesn't address the fundamental public policy question, which is what's going to ensure a more universal deployment. They're not mandated to provide service to anyone outside of those who they want to provide service to. That's the digital divide, folks. That is our fundamental policy challenge. So what's going to change the dynamic that will result in Montgomery County's deployment being into our agricultural communities as well as our low-income communities in addition to our high-value neighborhoods? And there's not an answer to that right now.
Right. I would say that the wireless, better than any other platform, has bridged the digital divide. I mean, if you look at the numbers, right, more of our low-income consumers use wireless than any other platform. The level of coverage is at 99.4%. 95% have the choice of at least 3 carriers for 4G. It has been fairly successful compared to other platforms. It is not perfect, and we do need to do more. But I do think we would be, I'm not sure it's the right answer to try to force a cable-like ubiquitous universal service deployment at this stage of this platform, because we still don't know what it's going to look like.
And I actually very much agree with that, and I give the wireless industry a whole lot of credit for the amount of competition that is underway. I'm not myself talking about cable-like mandatory build-out, but I am talking about allowing local communities to use their assets like fiber, like conduit, like light poles, like rooftops, and other kinds of resources that they have to try to make it more attractive for the industry to cover everyone. Because let's all be honest, wireline and wireless, low-income neighborhoods are not going to see the same kind of investment, the same robustness of investment. Even if there's coverage, it may not be the same. Now, would we really want to stop a county or a city from saying, we're going to reduce the cost of this conduit for you company because you are willing to make an enforceable commitment that you will deploy on an even basis, or because you're willing to make a commitment that you'll ensure a certain level of affordability for members of our community who we know may be buying wireless service because they need it as a lifeline, but can't afford both wireless and wireline, which all of us here in this room consider a basic aspect of functionality in our lives as Americans. And we see cities and counties undertaking those kinds of creative programs, thinking about that all the time. I can't count the number of cities and counties I know of that have released RFIs, very much like the Rhode Island RFI, or who have reached out to the industry. And I literally cannot count the number of meetings I've done myself personally with wireline and wireless companies, asking them on behalf of my communities, what will it take for us to get you to deploy throughout our community in certain kinds of neighborhoods, upgrade service, etc. So it's that localism, it seems to me, as well as use of assets, use of fees, that can actually result in some pretty good outcomes, and that is entirely lost if we reduce localism and local decision making.
If you indulge me, I'm so sorry. You know, on the,
we're talking about the most vulnerable among us and ensuring that folks have access and affordability. I think that was something that Commissioner Clyburn talked about at WIA's show. I just want to do a quick plug on the eve of DC Pride and the Pride March that's happening on Sunday. There's a great program called Power On. That's the LGBT Technology Partnership does, and it gets devices in the hands of those that are at risk, especially youth. So right now in America, 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBT, and so often they rely on mobile devices to connect with their community, to get information about sexual health, to ensure that they have a lifeline to public safety. And so that it's a great program, and it's a great way to ensure that those folks have what they need to connect to their community.
Great, thank you.
I'm sorry.
I know. Sometimes if people need to leave, we can run a little bit over.
We're panel talkers, but so Crown Castle, another plug. So we're also a member of Shelby Schools Healthcare Libraries Broadband Coalition. Through some of our fiber acquisitions, we participate in the E-rate programs, which specifically targets K-12, and Shelby does a lot of tremendous work. If nobody's reached out to them or looked into them, but they really do focus on bringing, broadband connectivity to anchor institutions. And one of the things that we talk about is it is a challenge. It's been a challenge, getting the rural and the digital divide and the ubiquitous connection, even now without talking about 5G. So if we can use or utilize anchor institutions as a phase one, if you will, really bring in robust broadband, at least to our anchor institutions, you have a platform then to go to a phase two or to springboard into a smart community type thing in a lot of different areas. And that is done through a lot of consortia. There are state broadband consortia that work on these issues every day, and it is a challenge, but there are people who are amazingly dedicated to bringing and improving this digital divide. So there are people, I just want to make sure, there are groups and groups of wonderful, talented, dedicated, smart people who are trying to figure out, this problem.
So this panel could probably go on for a couple of hours. So many issues yet to talk about: aesthetics, underground utilities, right? The RF health concerns, all sorts of important questions. But I want to leave sometime if there are any questions from the audience, make sure we're able to address those. Yes, Lydia. Mike to Lydia.
Thank you. Lydia Bayou with Event Driven News. You all have spoken a lot today about collaboration, and as I'm sure you all know, Governor McAuliffe signed the Virginia small cell bill into law today, and there are about 20 states that have enacted or are working on state small cell bills. So for the panel, with the FCC close within a number of months to issuing federal rules, how do you anticipate working with states as they also do bills? I mean, do you think the FCC is going to just supersede those state level bills? Do you see opportunities for the legislation to work together? Can you kind of go into that?
I just want to reiterate first that what we need now is a federal, state, and local public-private partnership campaign to break down barriers to deployment for fiber and wireless. And we need to all be working together because there's tremendous urgency, there's tremendous opportunity, there's not enough competition in these sectors, and we need that. We're very concerned, as from a local government perspective, that voices that seek to simply remove local government from the discussion will prevail. We're very concerned about that, and we think that will undermine our long-term ability to succeed with more deployment of infrastructure. So, yeah, we're on high alert now about being preempted, and we don't think that's the best way to go.
And just to follow up from the WIA perspective, we support the Virginia legislation and small cell legislation in other states. I think it's important, and we've seen in the past where states are actually ahead of the federal government in enacting or experimenting with these different sort of policies to see what promotes deployment in their communities. And I think that will definitely inform the FCC's process. Whether and how the FCC uses its preemption authority under 253, I think remains to be seen. But in the meantime, these providers are looking to deploy, today or yesterday. And so it's important that they have that support, and state legislation is one way that they've sought to do that, even seeing that the federal government is moving in that direction. So I think they will inform each other. As we had in the past, when the 2014 infrastructure order came out, WIA was a partner to NLC, NACO, and the CHOA and CTIA to say, how can we all sit down together and make sure that folks understand the new rules and how they can help implement them in their own communities.
Yes, we have one more question in the back. I think we have time for.
Just like to ask the industry panelists here. 4 years ago, the FCC opened up a proceeding specifically to look at whether they should update the RF emission rules, in particular looking at the health effects. From our perspective, at least half the questions that come in from the community are concerned, particularly now that you want to deploy them 35 feet from my daughter's bedroom window. The commission is looking at shortening and saying that 90 days is not sufficient for local government, and yet they've had this proceeding open for 4 years. So can you as industry say, do you think it would help community acceptance if the FCC completed either determining that the rules are okay or updating them? Do you think it would help for community acceptance if the FCC took leadership on its role as the exclusive arbiter of creating RF rules and addressed this issue?
Absolutely. I think it is definitely a space that the FCC should be active in. I think that there's space for an updated RF guide that's very consumer-centric. Because it is such an issue that folks raise and are concerned about, I think it is something that the FCC definitely can play a role in ensuring that there's enhanced education that's available, in a consumer-friendly format. And having said that, there are still communities and there are still folks in our communities who don't trust the federal government and won't trust anything that the FCC does. And, we see that out in the field. And so, while I think that the FCC definitely has this role to play, and it's a very important role, for some, it may not make a difference.
And all I'll say, I think Brian mentioned it earlier, I think clarity is important among all these things, that he mentioned, and this is one of them, the clarity that we have as an industry of what rules we have to follow, clarity from a municipal perspective of what, you can then tell your constituents, and then, communicating it out to the general public. So we think clarity is important.
I just want to reiterate, I think that, public acceptance or understanding of this issue is a barrier to deployment. Yeah. That's what we're trying to do, is break down barriers to deployment. The RF issue is a barrier to deployment, so we need to move forward to resolve that issue and enable this to have a more smooth path.
I was really struck by that in your comments, because the linkage is not always explicit. And I do think also it's a partnership between the FCC and the FDA. And so it's not completely an FCC function. That being said, and Commissioner Clyburn is on this page, when she was chairman, getting things done is always better than not, and 4 years is a long time. And so it'd be good to bring some closure to that. And yeah, I think it's very important. And the partnership with local government is so important. The FCC is not tremendously well positioned to do broad consumer education because of the nature of the organization. And it's super important to have partnerships on that.
Great. With that, let me thank our panelists, and a special thank you to Commissioner Clyburn for joining us for a wonderful discussion. I think a discussion that we'll keep having in the time to come. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
So I'm on their board and I do the slide. So I see. When I was going through this stuff, I was like, yes.
That's why I was like, yeah, she said
You talked to Sean in Philadelphia and you committed, you said you find the time to make something work.
So I've heard, yeah, I mean, I've heard your name and some people outside, I've never heard your name.
I don't trust Wikipedia. I don't trust. I don't trust. They all have agendas. Yeah. There's a lot of people I got. Lower frequencies or higher frequencies.